Alexander the Great, a legendary commander who changed the world.
Alexander is the linchpin of Western history, who charged into battle like a warrior king to remake the world in his Greek image.
A man of many mysteries, one of the biggest being, where exactly is he buried?
Alexander is one of the most important figures in history, and to find his tomb would really be a magnificent discovery. So it's no surprise that there have been hundreds of attempts to locate his tomb all over the world, even in Australia.
The search for Alexander's tomb is one of the greatest unanswered questions in archaeological history. Some researchers believe they know the answer.
Possibly the last of several tombs of the most romantic king that ever lived, Alexander the Great.
Will his final resting place ever be found? Whoever discovers it is sure to be famous for eternity. Alexander the Great, a life surrounded by myths and legends, like the tale of the Gordian knot. Legend has it that whoever unties the knot will become the ruler of Asia. Indeed, Alexander had no problem untying the knot and conquering the Persian Empire. And no other ruler has been able to take control over so much territory and at as fast a pace as Alexander. Alexander, superstar of the ancient world. To this day, his myth continues to inspire pop culture and Hollywood. By the time he was 30, he had conquered an empire larger than that of the Romans. However, it only stays intact for a few years.
In all of history, there's no more mythic figure than Alexander. He died young, he was raised a god, and he conquered the world in just 13 years. These are qualities, among many, that position him as a deity.
One of the reasons why Alexander's myth is still alive today is because his final resting place has not been found. British author Andrew Chugg is determined to find the conqueror's grave. He spends a great deal of his time collecting artifacts and writing books about Alexander the Great.
So there's this great mystery of Alexander's life, but in fact of his death, which is the fate of his tomb. We know an enormous amount about it. There are an enormous number of records stretching out to the 4th century AD for 700 years after Alexander's death, and then suddenly it disappears.
The search for Alexander's tomb takes Andrew across the former world empire and beyond, through Egypt and Greece, to Venice, back to where Christianity began. Alexander was born in Macedonia in 356 BC. A son of King Philip II and his first wife, Olympias. There are even legends about how he was conceived. He is said to be a descendant of Zeus, the father of all Greek gods.
Arthur, Hercules, Christ, and Alexander. According to myth, they were all conceived by a father who came to their mother before her husband. This is a recurring motif in world mythology that appears here in history.
As such, Alexander joins the historical ranks of the demigods, the most powerful heroes of the ancient world. In 336 BC, the 20-year-old is crowned Macedonian king, and just 2 years later, he launches an attack on Persia, which at the time was the most powerful empire in the world. Alexander's troops are victorious. But the young king isn't satisfied. He wants more and continues his campaign. After conquering Egypt, he moves on to Pakistan and India, ultimately setting his sights on the Arabian Peninsula. Seeking to secure his rule, he wears Persian robes, appoints former enemies to key positions, and marries a Persian princess, much to the shock of his Macedonian allies, who were not in favor of his close ties to former adversaries.
Some of Alexander's commanders didn't really approve of the way that he adopted freely these foreign and exotic customs and dress, and sometimes imposed them on his court. But what they didn't notice was how much the Alexandrian Empire was actually becoming more and more Greek.
However, Alexander consumes an excessive amount of alcohol, and this affects his personality. In an intoxicated stupor, he murders one of his closest friends. As a result, his generals no longer feel they can be loyal to the king, and instead become hateful and furious. Then Alexander dies suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of 32. His death raises questions. Was the king murdered? Perhaps even poisoned by his own generals. Alexander's empire crumbles as quickly as it was created. He dies without a successor. His generals, the Diadochi, battle it out to gain supremacy over his empire. The dominion collapses, and after a bloody civil war lasting more than 40 years, the Seleucids take over the heartland of the former Persian Empire, while the Antigonids gain command of the Macedonian ancestral land. Ptolemy and later his descendants take over Egypt's rule. Ptolemy I enjoys a privileged position amongst the Diadochi, as he is the one who took Alexander's body. However, over the centuries, details regarding the commander's final resting place fade away. All that remains is the legacy of Greek culture, which even extends all the way to India, as well as the numerous new cities in Egypt, all named Alexandria. This is where Andrew's search for the missing grave begins. Alexander the Great founds the city on the Mediterranean more than 2,300 years ago. It would go on to become the center of the ancient world. Today, it is the second largest city in Egypt with a population of over 5 million.
Alexander was open to the world. He was curious about other cultures, and he also believed that his legacy would last forever. And that was particularly embodied in the city that he created, Alexandria.
Today, Andrew Chugg meets historian Lennart Gilhaus at the Bibliotheca Alexandrina.
Hi, Andrew. Nice to meet you. Yes. Yeah, let's go inside.
This library is home to thousands of antique texts and maps. Andrew and Leonard are hoping to find out what happened to Alexander's remains.
The corpse stayed about 2 years in Babylon, and then a huge trek with his sarcophagus and this cataphalque went from Babylon to reach Macedonia.
Alexander died in 323 BC in Babylon, which today is in Iraq. Legend has it his body was preserved in honey and brought to Macedonia 2 years later, reportedly against Alexander's wishes. Rather, it is said he requested his burial take place in northern Egypt, in the Siwa oasis. However, his body never makes it to Macedonia. Instead, his funeral procession is ambushed and diverted to Egypt, supposedly on the orders of Ptolemy, a former general and friend of Alexander. Did he steal the corpse as a final gesture of friendship? Or does Ptolemy have an agenda of his own?
Ptolemy has Alexander's corpse, and basically that demonstrates to the Egyptian people that he is the legitimate successor. He's literally building the foundations of his empire on the grave of his predecessor.
But where does Ptolemy order the body to be taken? To secure his rule, it is imperative he keep Alexander's remains close by. One suitable place for this could be the necropolis of Saqqara, a good 20 kilometers south of Cairo. Egypt's rulers have been buried here for 3,000 years. In Saqqara, Andrew meets up with Egyptologist Tariq Sayed Tawfiq.
It was not only the biggest necropole, or one of the biggest necropole in Egypt, it is also one of the most continuously used necropole. So it was used continuously from the first dynasty until practically today. This shows how holy this place was for the ancient Egyptians as a burial ground.
Saqqara was first discovered in 1851 by Frenchman Auguste Mariette. Since then, numerous excavations have taken place. Researchers have come across countless tombs, many of which belonging to pharaohs. Could this be where Alexander the Great is buried? To this day, one of the excavation sites continues to puzzle scientists. It is full of artifacts and artwork that don't seem to fit in with the Egyptian world.
Here we are with a great company. We are with the statues of some of the most famous Greek poets and philosophers that were in the time of Alexander the Great, and that he was really influenced by, right here in Saqqara.
Despite being in bad condition, the statues represent men from Alexander's world. There's the poet Pindar, whose home was spared by Alexander after the conquest of Thebes. There's Homer, Alexander's favorite poet. And there's the philosopher Plato, who mentored Alexander's famous personal teacher, Aristotle. In particular, the statue of Homer seems to suggest a connection with Alexander. The Iliad, the poet's most important epic, also happened to be Alexander's favorite book.
Alexander always kept three things with him: a dagger, which he actually slept with because his father had been killed, a box which he had taken from his great enemy, the Persian King Darius, and in his box he kept his favorite text, the Iliad, which he believed was a manual on the art of war.
The Iliad leaves its mark on the young prince. Just like Homer's heroes, Alexander also wants to win wars and finally rule a global empire.
New kings wear old crowns, and the shoes that he wanted to fill were those of Achilles, warrior king. And his war was just like the Trojan War in the East, against an enemy that had offended all of Greece.
Could the statues from Saqqara be a clue as to where Alexander the Great's final resting place can be found? In addition to the Circle of Philosophers, as it is called, archaeologists have also found a temple complex dating back to the 4th century BC. It's dedicated to Pharaoh Nectanebo II and has special ties to Alexander.
And there is a link with Alexander potentially having been buried in the sarcophagus of Nectanebo II, which would have been unused because Nectanebo II was forced by the Persian invasion to flee to Ethiopia, and he never returned.
In the year 343 BC, after more than 100 years of foreign rule and subsequent independence, Nectanebo II has to defend himself against the Persians. To no avail, Nectanebo loses and dies in exile. He is the last of the native pharaohs, which marks the end of the ancient Egyptian era spanning nearly 3,000 years. In Saqqara, Nectanebo's tomb is left unused. A few years later, Egypt was conquered by Alexander's troops. Then, he died very suddenly, leaving no time to build him his own tomb. So why not make use of the pharaoh's empty sarcophagus?
problem is that we lack written documents from this time, yet this is a good way of giving a potential place where Alexander the Great could have been buried at the time.
There is also another, albeit more imaginative, link between Alexander and Nectanebo II.
According to the Ptolemies, the true father of Alexander is the exiled pharaoh Nectanebo II, who appeared to his mother as a god. This god took the form of a dragon, which is consistent with the story that his father told about finding his mother sleeping with a dragon.
Is there any truth behind the legend? Is Nectanebo II actually Alexander's biological father?
There was an important connection between Alexander the Great and Nectanebo II, because Alexander the Great sees himself as a continuation of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, and this gives him part of his legitimacy to become pharaoh of Egypt. And this is this fatherhood that he claims.
Nectanebo II goes into exile, and 10 years later, Alexander conquers Egypt. By 331 BC, he becomes a pharaoh. From that point on, rumors start circulating about him being a descendant of the ancient Egyptians. It would therefore make sense to bury him in his predecessor's coffin.
We cannot really say if Alexander the Great was buried in the sarcophagus of Nectanebo II, because it was taken to Alexandria. It was discovered at a site which we cannot say with certainty was the site of the tomb of Alexander the Great.
In 1798, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, French troops come across a stone coffin in a mosque in Alexandria. The hieroglyphics confirm it is the sarcophagus of Nectanebo II. Napoleon is seeking to weaken England's supremacy in the Mediterranean. He accomplishes the opposite, and this has archaeological consequences.
Under Napoleon, the French conquer Egypt and they discover a huge number of Egyptian antiquities. The British then defeat the French in battle. They kick them out of Egypt. And an English scientist, Edward Daniel Clarke, takes control of all of the Egyptian antiquities that the French have discovered.
Edward Daniel Clarke notes at the time,
"They all agreed in one common tradition, namely its being the tomb of Alexander, the founder of the city of Alexandria."
An engraving from 1573 provides another clue. The mosque in Alexandria bears the name Domus Alexandri Magni, the home of Alexander the Great. The mosque where Napoleon's soldiers found the sarcophagus over 200 years ago still stands in Alexandria. Is this the final resting place of Alexander the Great? Under the Ptolemies, the descendants of Ptolemy I, Alexandria becomes the new capital of Egypt. As a seat of power, the harbor city would need Alexander's corpse to retain its legitimacy.
By joining together the pieces of evidence, we can see that this sarcophagus could have been found by Ptolemy at Saqqara near the cemetery area of Memphis, and he could have buried Alexander's body in the sarcophagus there. That tomb lasted about 40 years, and then the second Ptolemy brought it to Alexandria.
Except when Napoleon's troops find the sarcophagus, it is empty. After the French are defeated, the sarcophagus is moved to the British Museum in London. The curator notes,
This object was believed to be associated with Alexander the Great when it entered the collection in 1803.
Andrew is convinced that Alexander the Great was entombed in Nectanebo's sarcophagus and brought to Alexandria decades later. But where are his remains?
It's very unlikely indeed that Alexander was buried in a simple prayer house. What's far more likely is that he was buried in an immense temple, and ancient writings attest to that.
Once again, the path leads to the library in Alexandria. Andrew is on his way there to meet up again with Lennart Gilhaus. Ancient texts speak of a magnificent tomb in Alexandria called Sema. One theory is that Alexander is buried there in a sarcophagus made of alabaster. Even centuries later, prominent admirers such as Julius Caesar were said to have visited him there.
Alexander was the mark against which Caesar and the Roman emperors measured themselves. As an example for conquerors, his empire was also an example for Rome.
Caesar's adopted son, Emperor Augustus, also visits the tomb of Alexander the Great in 30 BC.
Augustus looked at the body of it and she actually touched it and broke his nose off. But
Terrible.
yeah, but perhaps more important is when the Alexandrians came and said, oh, we have all the remains of the Ptolemies in another tomb. He said, no, I don't want to see these corpses. I only want to see a real king.
The ancient texts suggest that Alexander's tomb was there at least until the beginning of the Roman Empire. Roman poet Lucan describes Caesar's visit to the tomb in 48 BC. On the streets of Alexandria, Caesar beholds the mausoleum of Alexander the Great, towering like a high rock. After arriving there, he descends into the grotto where the mummy lies. In this way, the text provides concrete clues about the tomb's appearance. It speaks of a subterranean chamber with a monumental structure on top of it. However, the most important clue is the name of the tomb itself, Mausoleum.
What he's describing by explicitly referencing mausolea is something that looked like the original mausoleum, one of the 7 wonders of the world, at Halicarnassus, which was a very tall, lofty building with a pyramidal roof.
During the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists find the foundation of a mausoleum in Halicarnassus, what is now Bodrum, Turkey. The tomb belongs to a Persian governor called Mausoleum and dates back to the 4th century BC. The term mausoleum is derived from his name and is used for regal and monumental tombs. Did the legendary mausoleum of Halicarnassus also serve as a model for Alexander's tomb? Over the centuries, Alexandria's cityscape changes dramatically. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, the Ptolemies rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. The final ruler from the Macedonian Greek dynasty is the famous Queen Cleopatra. After her death in 30 BC, Egypt becomes a Roman province. Then, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christianity establishes itself. There are riots, pagan temples are destroyed, churches are built, and it is forbidden to worship the old gods.
It's possible his grave was destroyed or repurposed, like other pagan monuments in the 4th century, but we can't know it's not out there.
In 1365, Alexandria is the target of a crusade led by King Peter I of Cyprus. His Christian fighters plunder and destroy the city. Alexander's tomb disappears into the throes of history, and this time for good. Until now. Leonard and Andrew hope to find clues that will take them to the exact location of Alexander the Great's tomb. Journal entries from the Greek scholar Strabon provide valuable leads.
He's really saying that somewhere around the palace as the royal quarter of Alexandria, also the enclosure where the body of Alexander and the tombs of the other kings laid. So we know that the royal quarter was somewhere around here, almost sunken in the harbor, but also in this part of the city.
So we're looking at something that could constitute the middle of the town. We're looking at a walled enclosure, and yet it has to be adjoining the palaces.
The researchers use a special map to help them in their search. It was designed by Arab engineer Mahmoud Ahmed Hamdi in the 19th century when carrying out excavations in Alexandria.
So, in fact, we have to look somewhere around here in this spot to look for the tomb.
That's where we're pointed to if we want to believe all the sources at the same time.
They lead Andrew and Leonard to the heart of present-day Alexandria, to the Shalalat Gardens. And indeed, Andrew and Leonard discover a wall dating back to the time of Alexander the Great.
I think the first clue is the enormous size of the blocks.
Yeah.
They were held together by metal clamps, which was an expensive technology relative to mortar. So
Yeah.
they made the blocks as large as possible,
Yeah.
so as to avoid using too many of them.
Yeah.
The architectural style is typical of Alexander's time. As the founder of Alexandria, he left his mark all over the city, including the walls.
These are the first walls of Alexandria, and we are right at the crossroads of the city. And I agree with you that somewhere around here we have to look for the tomb of Alexander the Great.
A number of things suggest that Andrew and Leonard are right. In 2012, archaeologists discover an artifact not far from the city wall, now exhibited in the National Museum of Alexandria. A unique marble statue.
This as a great find. The degree of completeness and having the head attached to the body as well. So often it's been knocked off and you have to restore it.
Its wavy hair, nose, and eyes all resemble Alexander. In other works of art, he is depicted with more unusual attributes, such as ram's horns or Zeus's lightning bolt. Symbolic imagery reserved for those of divine descent.
It's very hard to determine whether we will ever be able to really find a depiction of Alexander the Great that is without doubt him. There are references in literature, for example in Plutarch, that describe his appearance, and there seems to be a standard way of depicting him, which is that he has this wavy, curly hair, and he's often shown in profile with his head tilted in this authoritative manner.
Archaeological findings and ancient texts strongly suggest that Alexander's tomb really must have been in Alexandria, at least for some time. But where is it now? Alexander's remains were not just history in ancient times, but continue to hold power in the present. It seems plausible that he was reburied for political reasons. As the saying goes, whoever has Alexander's body has a claim to his global empire.
Alexander's tomb is a really important aspect of national identity for modern Greece. And of course, it is said in the prophecy of Aristander of Telmessos that the land which receives the body in which his soul first dwelt shall always be absolutely happy and unvanquishable forever. So you never know, maybe that's why they want him as well.
Is it possible that Alexander's mummy made its way to Greece after all? In 2014, a stir is caused by a discovery in the Greek town of Amphipolis. Archaeologists come across an unusual tumulus. The burial site dates back to around 300 BC, and thus to the time of Alexander the Great. People quickly speculate as to whether this is where the great conqueror is buried. The tomb is lavish and covered with marble. All signs point to this belonging to an important figure.
Amphipolis is important to Alexander because his wife Roxanne lives there with his child Alexander, who becomes Alexander IV. In fact, just before Alexander comes of age and he's able to claim his father's throne, he's actually murdered at Amphipolis.
In the grave, archaeologists find the remains of 5 people: a woman about 60 years old, 2 men, an infant, and the remnants of a cremated body. But no further clues as to whom this resting place belongs to. Today, it is possible to almost completely reconstruct the Casta tomb, as it's called. The tomb consists of 3 chambers and can be accessed via a 13-step staircase. Originally, the entrances to the individual chambers were sealed with massive stone ashlars. The details on the mosaic flooring indicate that a high-ranking person was buried here. It must belong to a general or a king from the time of Alexander the Great. The hope, however, that the tomb indeed belongs to Alexander himself is yet to be backed by evidence. What we now know as modern Greece was not only the home of Alexander, but it was where his body was originally supposed to be brought to. Back then, the funeral procession was on its way to Aigai, the capital of ancient Macedonia, residence of the royal family. In recent years, archaeologists in Aigai have been discovering scores of ancient buildings, including a palace. An intact burial chamber is arguably the most significant find, tucked away under a massive mound. Angeliki Kotaridi is the scientific director of the excavation site.
Here stands there was a huge burial mound here. It was 110 meters in diameter and 13 meters high. Only a third of the tomb is sticking out. The main chamber is hidden underground. That is why it was excavated so late, and why both tombs weren't plundered.
Die 2 Gräber sind nicht geplündert worden.
The treasures are now on display in the museum. Among them is a lavishly decorated shrine made of pure gold, measuring 40 by 33 by 17 centimeters. Inside, archaeologists found charred human bones. Had they come across a royal tomb here in Aigai? Additional discoveries indicate this may be the case.
Also, these are the only 2 portrait heads of Alexander that we have that were most certainly made during Alexander the Great's lifetime.
Could this be Alexander's tomb?
The depiction of Alexander is interesting because he's not shown in the way he is in other portraits, this idealized version with the long curls and the soft facial features. It's very different and distinct. Perhaps that could suggest it's maybe more realistic, more lifelike.
The items found within the tomb feature intricate designs, and the tomb complex itself is enormous, leading researchers to believe that what they had found belonged to royalty. The researchers analyze the bones and come to the conclusion
The man was in his mid-40s. There's no way he's 30.
Philipp II kommt in Frage. Der war 45.
It could be Philip II. He was 45 years old when he died. Alexander the Great was only 33 years old, so it can't be him.
Den Alter des Mannes, das Skeleton.
other items are found that would rule out Alexander as the tomb's occupant. A pair of gold-plated leg splints. One of the splints is 2.5 centimeters shorter than the other, and it is commonly known that Philip walked with a limp.
If one thing is for certain, this is where Philip II was laid to rest. And if you're looking for Alexander, this is the only place on earth where you can get this close to him. That is because we have the only things that we know Alexander had held in his hands.
These are the burial objects chosen by Alexander himself for the funeral of his father, Philip II. They are the weapons, silver, and art. Alexander gave his father an honorable burial. That was not a foregone conclusion because he and his father were not particularly close. Amid the struggle for power and influence over the kingdom, Alexander's succession to the throne was called into question, even causing him to go into exile. But he and his father were able to reconcile. But shortly thereafter, Philip dies. For many, this was not a coincidence. To this day, whether or not Alexander was involved in his father's assassination remains unclear. Nevertheless, Philip II is instrumental in Alexander's success. He captures Greek city-states and goes on to establish the Corinthian League. Under his rule, Macedonia becomes the most potent military power in the ancient world. With the help of his father's army, Alexander the Great conquers his empire. The life and work of Alexander the Great continues to captivate us to this day. The living history group Hetairoi, Greek for comrades, brings Alexander's era back to life.
Our mission is to bring people closer to history in museums. We do this by giving them the opportunity not only to look at the objects, but also to touch and feel them.
Members of the group make the costumes and the props themselves using archaeological objects as models. One symbol in particular is linked to Alexander, the Argead star.
It's more or less a dynastic symbol which was frequently used in the kingdom of Macedonia. It lets people know that you belong to this kingdom. And it looks a bit like Alexander's family crest.
The Vergina sun with its 16 rays appears on the archaeological finds from several Macedonian royal tombs. Many things suggest that it must also be found in Alexander's tomb.
We can assume the star is to be found there very often because it is the personal symbol of Alexander's royal dynasty.
Despite all the uncertainty surrounding the location of Alexander's tomb, the history group would rather keep the historical figure's myth alive.
Alexander the Great was without a doubt the best commander of his time. He was someone with a clear vision. Some might even say delusions of grandeur. And he was someone who wanted to basically go to the ends of the earth and beyond, if possible.
Alexander conquered Persia, Asia, and last but not least, Egypt. Most historians agree that this is where the famous commander was buried. Historical scribes unanimously refer to a burial place in Alexandria. It is also said that Alexander himself wanted to be buried in Egypt. Of all the countries he conquered, this one on the Nile was very dear to his heart. The commander was fascinated by its ancient traditions and mysterious rites, so much so that he even pays homage to ancient Egyptian deities, like the Apis bull. To be selected as sacred bulls by the priests, they need to have a certain fur color. Together with Egyptologist Professor Tariq Sayed Tawfiq, Andrew Chugg visits the ancient Egyptian necropolis of the Apis Bull.
The Apis Bull is a very important deity at the end of the Pharaonic period and the beginning of the Greek period in ancient Egypt. And one of the most important things is that Alexander the Great, when he comes to Egypt and when he comes to Memphis, one of his first actions is to bring offerings to the Apis Bull in the area of the Ptah Temple in Memphis.
In life and in death, the Apis Bull is an important deity to the ancient Egyptians. This is why their carcasses were mummified and buried in extra-large sarcophagi weighing up to 60 tons.
There isn't a sarcophagus specifically from Alexander's time. We don't know what happened to that bull. Is that right?
Yes, because unfortunately, from the 24 sarcophagi that we have here, only 4 are inscribed with the names of kings.
Alexander was open to Persia's Eastern culture. He didn't just spread Greek culture, but also adopted the traditions and knowledge of the conquered peoples. In many respects, he laid the foundations for advanced civilizations to come.
The Macedonian Empire, created by Alexander, is really the precedent and the antecedent empire that Rome and the Romans copied in many ways in creating their empire. And that's led directly into modern European culture, which itself spread around the world a few hundred years ago.
Alexander's enormous impact was well known amongst his contemporaries. Some even considered him a deity.
It's the most prominent tomb and shrine in the Roman Empire for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then suddenly, Alexander's tomb vanishes and creates this enormous cliffhanger in the story of the tomb as to what on earth happened to it.
According to modern research, it is plausible that Alexander's tomb was actually once located in Alexandria, in the very place where another famous figure of the ancient world was buried, Saint Mark, author of the Gospel of Mark.
Well, so we have this coincidence in space, the place where St. Mark's body, and therefore where his tomb had presumably been, in Alexandria, seems to be the same place as the site of Alexander's tomb.
Andrew Chugg bases his assumption on old maps of the city, ranging from ancient times to the Middle Ages. According to these maps, Alexander the Great's mausoleum is located in the former city center of Alexandria. In turn, the tomb of St. Mark can be found near the eastern city wall of medieval Alexandria. 2 tombs in one place? Was Alexander's tomb simply repurposed?
Is it possible that the story is true? That his monument actually became a tomb for Mark? If it's true that the tomb of Alexander was repurposed as the tomb of Mark, it would have been merely a repurposing of the city's pagan patron for the Christian patron.
According to tradition, he becomes Bishop of Alexandria around 65 AD and dies a martyr just 3 years later. However, it is not until a good 300 years later that evidence of his burial place is found in Alexandria.
We also have a coincidence in time, which is that the last mention of Alexander's body in Alexandria occurs a couple of years before the first mention by St. Jerome of a tomb of St. Mark in Alexandria.
One corpse disappears and another one appears, almost simultaneously at the same place.
Alexander was not just a historic figure. he was worshipped as a god. So when the Christians came to Egypt, his worshippers and his temple were in jeopardy.
In the late 4th century, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan customs are quashed, and its gods are banned. Every ancient place of worship is either closed down, converted, or destroyed.
Because so many of the pagan monuments were repurposed as Christian sites, it begs the question, could the tomb of Alexander have been repurposed as a Christian monument?
Did Alexander's tomb need to disappear? And is that why it could become a tomb for St. Mark? The only thing that seems certain is that the evangelist died in Alexandria in the middle of the 1st century. After this, 3 centuries pass before any indications of the location of his tomb are found.
So these things have led me to hypothesize that at that critical point, the date being about 391 AD, maybe the body of Alexander was re-identified as the body of St. Mark.
Andrew's theory brings him to Venice. After all, this is where the bones of St. Mark can be found today. They were smuggled into the lagoon city by 2 merchants in the 9th century.
In St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, there's an intriguing mosaic. What it shows is a mummy being taken from Alexandria. Now, this has been interpreted as the mummy of St. Mark, one of the first evangelists and gospel writers. But there's the other suggestion that if this is a mummy, would that not make it a royal personage? Could it, in fact, be Alexander the Great?
St. Mark's remains now rest in St. Mark's Basilica. Andrew doesn't receive permission to examine them, but he continues to search for clues. In the St. Apollonia Museum, he comes across a piece of an ancient stone block. Restorers found it in the crypt at St. Mark's Basilica in 1962.
8 meters away from where this block was buried was the tomb of St. Mark for most of its history in Venice before it got moved up to sit within the actual altar on the floor above in 1811.
Andrew believes this stone ashlar arrived in Venice with the other relics belonging to St. Mark.
They would have no way of knowing that this was not associated with St. Mark. They would have no way of knowing that it was Macedonian in its style and origins.
In fact, the stone can be traced back to the royal family of Macedonia. It has an Argidian star on it, the royal symbol of the family of Alexander the Great. A similar star is also found on Macedonian bronze coins, in the tomb belonging to King Philip II, Alexander's father, and on a fresco of King Antigonus from the 1st century BC.
Then we have the sarissa. It starts with a leaf blade at the top, and you can see how the point would have just touched the edge of the block at the upper left-hand corner.
Supposing that the spear does go diagonally from the upper left corner to the lower right corner, it is possible to calculate the original dimensions of the stone block. 298 centimeters in length and 118 centimeters in height.
The burning fact that has emerged about this block that ties everything together is that it's the same size as another part of the tomb of Alexander the Great, the sarcophagus that was made for the last native pharaoh of Egypt, Nectanebo II.
Andrew Chugg is convinced the stone is part of the outer casing of Nectanebo II's sarcophagus. The sarcophagus, in which no other Egyptian pharaoh but Alexander the Great ever found his final resting place. Perhaps by analyzing the stone, Andrew Chugg will be able to substantiate this theory. However, the authorities still refuse to give him the approval to do so. This would be an incredible punchline in history. Alexander the Great died in Babylon, was first buried in Alexandria, and was later moved to Venice under the guise of a false identity, as a Catholic saint.
Assuming that this is the same body that was brought back to Venice in 828 AD, then there's an excellent chance that these are the remains of Alexander the Great.
The mummy was taken out of Alexandria over 1,000 years ago. Researchers aren't sure whether the bones currently found in St. Mark's Basilica are the same as the ones that were originally brought there. Relic trading was booming, and the bishops weren't always accurate with respect to the origins of the remains.
While relics are meant to represent some kind of a material truth, they depend on faith and a story. A counterfeit story meant a counterfeit relic, and there were many in medieval Europe. Martin Luther once asked, how could there be 18 apostles in Germany if Jesus had but 12?
From a scientific perspective, there's another fact that calls the origins of the relics into question. During a palace revolution in 976, St. Mark's Basilica went up in flames. The relics were also burned. Yet, as if by a miracle, they suddenly reappear in 1094.
They may not have managed to preserve the body here, but the foundations of the basilica managed to preserve the star shield block that was brought from Alexandria.
It's still unclear as to whether the bones in St. Mark's Basilica actually belong to Alexander the Great. This is also partly because the bones cannot be analyzed. Andrew Chugg is determined to continue his search for evidence.
Possibly the last of several tombs of the most romantic king that ever lived, Alexander the Great.
The desperate search for Alexander the Great's tomb adds intrigue to his fascinating and mysterious story. If St. Mark's tomb in Venice is indeed Alexander's tomb, this story would have a Hollywood ending.
That's what makes Alexander the Great so captivating. A mythical figure who achieved something we only hear about in legends and myths.
Be it in Venice or elsewhere around the globe, the person who scientifically proves they found Alexander's tomb will henceforth be linked with the greatest discoveries in archaeological history.